Okay, so after the technical difficulties, here we are talking about the micro foundations of sticky prices. So as I said, um, this afternoon, we really want to kind of talk about some of the micro foundations or the microeconomics behind the assumptions that we made in our model this morning. So one of the important assumptions that we made is that prices are sticky, right? So what I mean by prices are sticky is prices are slow to adjust, and expected inflation is slow to adjust, and actual inflation is slow to adjust. And so what this means is that, for instance, one of the reasons this is such an important assumption is we assume that if expected inflation was fixed in the short run, meaning slow to adjust, then it means that central banks can control both nominal interest rates and real interest rates. So when they change the nominal interest rate, they're also changing the real interest rate because inflation doesn't adjust. And this violates money neutrality, right? This violates money neutrality because in money neutrality, real variables should not change when nominal variables like the money supply change. So this assumption of sticky prices is crucial to thinking about why money neutrality doesn't hold. And so why exactly would inflation and prices be sticky? And so I want to talk about a couple of reasons here why many economists believe that prices are not flexible, particularly in the very short run. And by the very short run, I mean day to day, week to week, month to month, right? That prices adjust, but they only do so very, very slowly. The first reason to think that prices are sticky is because of imperfect information. The fact is, many people don't know what's going on in markets. Information about what's going on is often costly. It's costly in terms of time. It's costly in terms of finding the information, even when it's available. And sometimes the information is just simply not available. So, for instance, you and me as individuals, we can't directly observe aggregate changes in the prices. We see the prices of the things that we buy every day, right? So on a daily basis, I go to the grocery store, I maybe get gas, buy a couple of things on Amazon, but I'm not observing a lot of prices every day. And as a result, I can't directly observe changes in inflation. Maybe I can observe them with a lag, right? Meaning when lots of prices change over long periods of time, I can begin to see that in the one or two prices that I see every day. But many people can't observe this directly. The only way that we know what aggregate inflation is when the government reports the statistics. And that often is with a lag, right? So we only learn about what's happening to inflation with a lag of a quarter or sometimes half a year, right? When we begin to collect the data. And so imperfect information is one reason why prices are slow to adjust. Another reason why prices are slow to adjust is price contracts and wage contracts. Many prices and wages are really predetermined, right? So when you enter, let's say that you own a business and you have a supplier for your business, usually you'll enter into a price contract that sets the price. And so that price is not going to change, right? It's not going to change, at least until you enter into a new contract. The same with wages, right? Many people operate either with explicit wage contracts, or sometimes implicit wage contracts. So, for instance, at Cornell College, basically Cornell sends me a contract every year at the beginning of the school year and says, this is your wage, okay? Now, I can try to negotiate that before I sign the contract, but once I sign the contract, my wage is basically fixed for a year. And so because of price and wage contracts, once again, prices and wages are very, very slow to adjust. Coordination failure is another reason for price stickiness that many economists have identified. And that is that many firms are reluctant to change prices first, because if you change your price first, it changes your relative price, right? So to think of an example, let's think about, let's say, the iPhone and the Samsung Galaxy phone, right? Which are essentially substitutes for each other. They're kind of in the similar market. Maybe Apple doesn't want to increase the price of the iPhone if they don't see Samsung increase the price of the Galaxy. And maybe Samsung doesn't want to increase the price of the Galaxy first until they see Apple increase the price of their phone. And so as a result, that creates some reluctance for firms to change prices because they don't want to be the first to change their price because that will make their good much more expensive. And so this kind of coordination failure, right? That one firm would increase their price if all other firms were increasing their price, but they don't want to go it alone, means that firms oftentimes are very slow to change prices. There's also menu costs that are important for many firms. And menu costs are really the cost of changing prices, right? So, nowadays, I guess, we don't have, I was going to say we don't have very many catalogs, printed catalogs, until I look in my mailbox, and around Christmas season, thousands of these things come to me. I don't know how in the world I'm still getting a printed catalog. But the problem with a printed catalog from a firm's perspective is it really fixes the price. The price cannot change once that catalog is printed. And if you want to change prices, you have to print a new catalog. And that's a really big disincentive to change prices. And so many firms who advertise prices are very, very reluctant to change prices. And if they do, they only will do it once a year or at seasonal times of the year. Finally, there's the problem of efficiency wages. And we'll talk about this a little bit more on Monday. But efficiency wages is really the idea that firms are always reluctant to cut wages. Firms very reluctant to cut wages because lower wages actually reduce productivity. So in other words, this is kind of a counterintuitive idea. Firms actually want to keep wages high because when they keep wages high, they keep productivity high. And if they cut wages too much, they will reduce productivity. And why is that, right? Because we think, well, firms want wages to be as low as possible. But efficiency wages says, no, firms don't want wages to be as low as possible because that's going to impact the productivity of their labor force. And why is that? Well, one reason is lower worker effort. If you cut workers' wages, they're just going to work less hard, right? And so particularly in industries where it's hard to monitor how hard workers are working, one of the ways that you kind of ensure that workers are working hard is you pay them higher wages. The other problem with cutting wages is that you are likely to see your best workers leave. So, if you cut everybody's wages by 20%, who's most likely to stay? Your worst workers. And who's most likely to leave? Your best workers, because they can find a higher paying job elsewhere. And so once again, firms are very reluctant to cut wages. And they're very reluctant to increase worker turnover, right? Because firms invest a lot of money and training into workers. And so once again, they're worried to cut wages because if they cut wages, that might encourage a lot of workers to leave. And so if you take all these things together, and in fact, I've just talked about a few of the reasons why prices and wages are sticky. If you take all of these together, you begin to see that markets they're not always the perfectly competitive markets that we assumed in the classical model, where something changes and instantly prices and markets adjust. In the real world, when there are changes, prices are slow to adjust and markets are slow to adjust. And that's a market failure, right? That means that markets do not work perfectly competitively. And that also violates money neutrality in the sense that when there's a change in a nominal variable like the money supply and the price level, it might actually lead to a change in a real variable if not all prices adjust in the same way. Okay, so that's kind of the background to our assumption that prices are sticky. Now, how long are prices sticky? To what extent are prices sticky? That's a very complicated question. But I think most economists believe that if you look at the behavior of most prices, they are slow to adjust. And that creates a lot of different kinds of market failure, right? Creates a lot of different kinds of market failure. Let's talk a little bit more about the background, the micro foundations of monetary policy and interest rates. So how exactly does the central bank control interest rates? We just assumed that the central bank controls interest rates this morning, but we didn't really talk about how. And so really what I want to talk about here is just kind of a review of some of the things we talked about in Principles of Macro, right? Where we talk about how the central bank goes about changing monetary policy and changing interest rates. And so I do want to spend a couple of minutes just kind of reviewing this from Micro. So how does the central bank control interest rates? Remember on Tuesday, we talked about the quantity theory, right? MV is equal to P times Y. And what did the quantity theory, the classical quantity theory, assume? That real GDP is exogenous, meaning it's fixed because of money neutrality. But it also assumed that V was exogenous, the velocity of money, that people didn't change basically their money demand over time. They wanted to hold a constant ratio of money. However, in our short run model and in Keynesian's theory, one way to think about V and how it's different is that velocity isn't fixed over time. In fact, velocity changes. And it actually changes with the interest rate. So in other words, what happens when the interest rate goes up? When the interest rate goes up, people now want to hold less money. And why is that? Because you have to think about the interest rate as the cost of holding money. Okay, the interest rate is the cost of holding money. When I hold money, I can't put the money in a bank and get an interest rate on it. So when interest rates go up, money demand should go down. And when interest rates go down, you'd expect money demand to go up. And when money demand goes up, velocity goes down, right? So velocity and money demand here are inversely related. When you hold more money, money turns hands less quickly. And when you hold less money, money turns hands more quickly. So the quantity theory, money demand in the Keynesian or the short run looks a lot different than how it did in the classical model. Here we assume that money demand goes down as the interest rate goes up, and money demand goes up as the interest rate goes down. And remember, money demand moves inversely with velocity. So when money demand goes down, velocity goes up. So velocity and money demand are not fixed in this short run model. So what determines the interest rate? The interest rate is just determined by money demand and money supply. This gives us some idea then about how monetary policy impacts interest rates. Because what happens when the Fed increases the money supply? An increase in the money supply leads, actually I have this wrong. This is a decrease in the money supply, right? What happens when the Fed decreases the money supply? The money supply curve shifts to the left and interest rates go up, okay? So in other words, how does the central bank how does the central bank increase interest rates? They increase interest rates by cutting the money supply. Vice versa, what if the Fed wants to reduce interest rates? Then they increase the money supply, okay? And so this is a relationship that we talked about a lot in Principles of Macro, right? That whenever the Fed wants to reduce interest rates, they increase the money supply. And whenever they want to increase interest rates, they cut the money supply. And so this is really kind of the background, right? We just assumed this morning that the central bank increases and decreases interest rates. But how do they do that? They do that by changing the supply of money, right? When they put more money into the economy, that means that there's more bank reserves, more lending, and that puts downward pressure on interest rates. When they cut the money supply, that means that there's less money flowing in the financial system, and that increases interest rates. This is the nominal interest rate, but of course, when inflation is sticky, a fall in the nominal interest rate means that there's also a fall in the real interest rate. So monetary policy can be thought of in terms of changes in the money supply or changes in interest rates. Why does the Fed tend to focus on changes in interest rates? Well, as I have down here, interest rates really are they more directly impact the decisions that most of us make on a daily basis, such as savings and investment and consuming. And quite honestly, most people understand interest rates better than they understand the money supply, right? The money supply is kind of an abstract idea for most of us, but an interest rate is a much more concrete idea. And so that's part of the reason why the Fed focuses on interest rates, is the interest rates are, I think, much better understood, and they're much more concrete target for policymakers to focus on. But could you think about monetary policy only in terms of the money supply? Sure you could, right? Sure you could. You could think about this either way, as monetary policy in terms of interest rates, monetary policy in terms of the money supply. They really are the flip sides of the same coin, right? They really are the flip sides of the same coin. And so, in general, we'll talk about monetary policy as determining interest rates, but it's important to remember that in the background here, there's also this idea that that the central bank is changing interest rates by changing the money supply, right? And so the Fed tends to focus on interest rates. Which interest rate does the Fed tend to focus on the most? The federal funds rate. And if you remember from principles, or for those of you who took money in banking, what's the federal funds rate? The federal funds rate is the interest rate at which banks lend money to other banks. And that is that's the interest rate that the Fed kind of focuses on most day to day, right? That in essence, how the Fed manages its day-to-day monetary policy is they pick a target, or they pick a goal for the federal funds rate that they think is consistent with what the economy needs in terms of output and inflation and unemployment, and then they try to maintain that federal funds rate over time. So just to flip way back here, here's actually a graph of what the federal funds rate looks like. And you can see the federal funds rate, this graph looks similar to other interest rates, right? As I said this morning, all interest rates tend to move together. So in one sense, when the Fed is focusing on the federal funds rate, they're also influencing other interest rates in the same way. But the specific interest rate that the Fed focuses on is this federal funds rate. And as I said, it's the interest rate on interbank lending. And this is closely controlled by the Fed. Where is this federal funds rate today? Zero, essentially zero. So you don't see this here because we don't have the most recent data, but essentially the Fed has, in the midst of the COVID crisis, reduced the federal funds rate all the way back to zero, or just slightly positive. And so, what does that tell you? Well, it tells you the Fed is trying to stimulate short-run output, right? And based on what we talked about this morning, why are they stimulating short-run output? Because they believe short-run output is negative right now, which I don't think is a crazy belief, right? Pretty clearly, short-run output is negative, and so the Fed is trying to stimulate output by cutting interest rates, right? And they begin by cutting that federal funds rate, and then that puts downward pressure on other interest rates in the economy. So hopefully, a lot of that is somewhat familiar with you. One last thing here in terms of reviewing monetary policy. What are the exact tools that the Fed uses to control the money supply? Well, once again, I hope that you all remember this from Principles of Macro, but it's worth just spending a couple of minutes going back and reviewing this some. So the primary tool of monetary policy that the Fed uses is open market operations, right? Remember, what are open market operations? The Fed buying and selling T-bills. And so this is essentially the way that the Fed puts new money into the economy or pulls money out of the economy. So what happens when the Fed conducts an open market purchase of T-bills? They essentially buy T-bills from banks. And how do they pay for them? New money, right? Specifically, what the Fed does is they increase that monetary base, right? And if you remember what the monetary base is, I should write this in here. The monetary base is currency plus reserves, right? C plus R, currency plus reserves. So, damn it, what happened? Something got screwed up. Okay, there we go. So how does the Fed increase the monetary base to buy these bills? Either they would give the bank currency, or they would just create reserves. And usually these reserves are created electronically, right? The Fed would just go into the bank's balance sheet and say, you have fewer bonds, I'll take those, and now you have some reserves. Where do these reserves come from? Out of thin air, right? And so the Fed can change the monetary base, and when they change the monetary base, that means that banks either have more currency or more reserves to lend out. That leads to an increase in the money supply, right? And if you remember, there's a multiplier process there, that if the Fed changes the monetary base a little bit, the money supply will change by more, because new reserves create new lending, new money, which creates new reserves, which creates new money, which creates new reserves, right? If you remember that from principles. So that's typically how the Fed actually does control the money supply, is they control the monetary base. And then how do they increase or decrease the monetary base? By buying or selling T-bills, right? Hopefully that all is familiar to you. And why does the Fed do it this way? Well, as I have here down at the bottom, the big advantage is the Fed could, in theory, buy anything, buy and sell anything. They could buy and sell Star Wars action figures on eBay. The problem is the Fed is doing very big transactions, right? They need to be buying and selling something in big liquid financial markets. And what's the biggest, most liquid financial market? Treasury bills. All right, and U.S. Treasury bills. And so that tends to be where the Fed focuses its action. And the Fed's quite good at this, right? They can make big changes, they can make small changes, they can make predictable changes, right? All of that is very good for the Fed, right? And so that's why the Fed tends to control the money supply this way. Very quickly, there are other ways that the Fed could change the money supply. One is they could change that reserve requirement ratio. So if you remember this from principles, they could change how much required reserves banks hold. And so, for instance, the Fed could increase the money supply by asking banks to hold fewer required reserves. If they hold fewer required reserves, that means they can lend out more money, and that will increase the money supply. However, the Fed doesn't usually use this, in part because the changes would be pretty unpredictable. Who knows how much money banks would lend out if they didn't have any required reserves? Would they lend it all out? Would they keep some of it? It's a little unpredictable for the Fed. It would also be very costly for banks if the Fed was always kind of raising the required reserve when they wanted to cut the money supply and cutting the required reserve when they wanted to increase the money supply, because banks manage their required reserves quite a bit. And if they didn't know what to expect on a day-to-day basis, it would be very costly for them. The Fed could also, instead of buying and selling T-bills, the Fed could make loans to banks. They could create money and make loans. They could make it cheaper for banks to borrow, or they could just lower their standards and say, we're happy to lend to more banks. But in reality, the Fed doesn't like to use this either. The Fed wants to be the lender of last resort. That's what LOLR means, right? In other words, the Fed doesn't want to be a regular source of funds for banks. They want to only be there in the case of emergency, the lender of last resort. So the Fed doesn't really use discount lending, right, which is what we usually call when the Fed lends to a bank. The Fed doesn't want to use its lending to banks as a way of controlling the money supply, because it's more reserved for emergency purposes, right? That lender of last resort. These are the traditional ways that the Fed changes the money supply, but there are a lot of less traditional ways. And in fact, we're going to talk next week that during the 2008 crisis, the Fed experimented with a number of different ways of controlling the money supply, such as buying and selling T-bills, or I'm sorry, buying and selling T-bonds. buying and selling other assets. And in fact, during the COVID crisis, the Fed has experimented in new ways. For instance, the Fed has been buying up corporate debt, right, as a way of trying to provide more liquidity in corporate bond markets so that firms can borrow more during these times that it's hard to borrow. And so the Fed, we'll talk next week about some other ways that the Fed has worked to try to change the money supply outside of these conventional ways. But these are the big conventional ways, right? And that's why I have up here at the top the conventional tools of monetary policy. And traditionally, these are the ways we think about the Fed changing the money supply. But as we're going to talk about next week, the Fed has been much more experimental in thinking about other ways that they can change the money supply and other ways that they can potentially impact the economy. Okay? So that's really all I wanted to talk about today. As I said, a lot of this was just kind of background material for some of the assumptions or some of the things that we glossed over this morning when we talked about our short run macro model. So where are we headed next week with this short run macro model? Well, next week, we really have a couple of last pieces, right, to add to our model. One is we haven't talked about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, right? And we haven't talked a lot about stabilization policy. We've talked a little bit, but I think there's more that we want to say about stabilization policy. So that's really the focus of chapter 13, which is what we're going to talk on Monday, where we talk about stabilization policy, aggregate demand, aggregate supply. And then on Tuesday, we're really going to do the last piece, which is to talk about finance, right? We're going to talk about financial crises. We're going to talk about how finance in general, financial systems can contribute to business cycles and what role they can play in our short run macro model. So we're kind of, I would say, about halfway through developing this short run macro model, right? It takes us about 4 days to get through it, and we've really kind of done 2. But hopefully you're feeling a little bit more comfortable, right, with using this. And as we build this model out, hopefully, your comfort level with this short run macro model will only increase. Hopefully the homeworks over the weekend that you're assigned will also help increase your familiarity and get you more comfortable with the mechanics of this. As we look towards next week, next Thursday is our second exam, and far and away the biggest part of this second exam is on the short run macro model, right? So this is a huge part of what's going to be on exam number 2. So so anyway, we're making progress toward our ultimate goal of having a relatively full model of how macro economies behave in the short run. So, okay, well, does anybody have any questions about anything before I let you go for the weekend? Okay, well, thank you. It seems like it was a long week. We covered a lot of material this week, right? We really did cover a lot of material. Looking forward, I hope that next week will be a little bit less chaotic. I can't promise that, but I'm going to look to maybe cut back our hours a bit, given that we have a couple of homeworks to do, and we have an exam. So I'm going to look and see if there's some ways that maybe we can trim back the class hours and give you a little bit more time to work on all these things as we move into the third week and things start to come to head and we start to get tired. But we're doing well, right? We're more than halfway there. So congratulations. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all. Have a good weekend.